My name is Mina Girgis. I'm the Director of Education, Campus, and Community Engagement at Cal Performances. And I'd like to thank our sponsors that made this program possible. You met Masako on stage right now, and the Correct Foundation, whose support makes Illuminations possible at Cal Performances. I don't want to speak for too long, but I'd like to introduce our moderator this evening. Professor Michael Omi is a professor emeritus at UC Berkeley. He taught in ethnic studies for many years, and his work on race and racial theory has been very influential in the field. So without further ado, please help me welcome our panelist and Professor Michael Omi.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Whoops. Hello. Thanks, Mina. I really appreciate that. On behalf of the panel, I really appreciate your presence here for this post-performance discussion and conversation. We're glad you stuck around, and thank you for joining us. I'm thrilled, and I usually don't use that term very often or lightly, to really be able to moderate this distinguished group of panelists who's going to reflect on the significance and the meaning of Story Boldly's Defining Courage, as well as to contextualize it, both historically and with respect to an increasingly contentious political climate, a climate in many ways that we have witnessed a sort of deliberate and concerted attempt to strip U.S. history of any semblance of this nation's racial past and very troubling legacy. So with that, I'm going to head for my first question, and we'll get the conversation started. First off, we have Alice Yang Murray, who's a professor and chair of history department at UC Santa Cruz. Alice is also the founding faculty member of UCSD's Critical Race and Ethnic Studies Department, as well as being the co-director of the Center for the Study of Pacific War Memories. Her research and teaching is far-ranging and focuses on the memories of mass incarceration, the struggles for redress, Asian American history, oral history, and women's history. Let's have Don Tamaki. Don, you got to raise your hand so we can. Don Tamaki is senior counsel at the San Francisco law firm of Manami Tamaki LLP. And in the 1980s, Don was a member of the pro bono legal team that reopened the landmark 1944 Supreme Court case of Fred Korematsu, overturning Mr. Korematsu's criminal conviction for defying the incarceration of some 120,000 Japanese Americans. In 1921, Don Tamaki was appointed by California Governor Gavin Newsom to serve on the 9-member California Reparations Task Force that produced the groundbreaking 1,000-plus page final report that traced the cumulative effects of slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and persistent structural racism in shaping the experiences of African Americans. The report provided specific recommendations to the California State Legislature to address and remedy the harms resulting from this legacy. Over the last 4 decades, Philip Kan Gotanda has been instrumental in bringing stories of Asians in the United States to mainstream American theater. Philip has specialized in the Japanese American family, writing a cycle of works in theater, film, and opera, chronicling their experiences, and as well as telling their stories from the early 1900s to the present period. Philip's newest work, which just was here at Berkeley at the Zellebach Playhouse a month or so ago, was the opera Both Eyes Open, created with composer Max Dykers, that interrogates the interior life of a Nisei farmer who, upon his self-inflicted death, revisits the events of his life. In his day job, Philip is a professor with the Department of Theater, Dance, and Performance Studies here at Berkeley. And perhaps he needs no introduction, but for 30 years, David Ono has anchored 3 evening shows a day in Los Angeles, including LA's overall top-rated newscast, Eyewitness News at 6 p.m.
Good enough.
No, let me go on. David also has a deep commitment to telling the lesser-known stories about the world, especially stories about underserved communities that deserve a voice, that deserve recognition. His nonprofit Story Boldly allows David to pull off big projects like the Defining Courage stage production we witnessed this evening, and a variety of film projects. He was recently named top news anchor in America by Broadcasting Cable, and his Faceism series just won Best News Series in America with the Edward R. Murrow Awards. These are our distinguished, as I said, panelists. And thank you for being here too, David. I mean, you must be exhausted. I've been thinking, as I said, about a quote by famed novelist, playwright, and social critic Gore Vidal. Gore Vidal once said, "We are the United States of amnesia. We learn nothing because we remember nothing." And I think the question I'd like to ask our panelists here is, why is it important that we remember this history, as well as what can we learn from it? And David, I might want to start with you, because you've talked about this project as being one of a sort of historical reclamation work. And maybe you should start and speak to what that means.
Well, first of all, I look, for stories that move people and personal stories. And I just felt the Nisei soldier story was, number one, I was ignorant to it, so I had my own ignorance. Believe it or not, I'm Japanese American, but I grew up in Texas, where there was no talk of this. My family's actually from Japan. So I had a whole blind spot in my life, 30-something years ago when I moved to California. I'd never heard of this incarceration of Japanese Americans. I'd never heard of the 442nd. And then when I started to learn about them, you face a little bit of shame for your own ignorance. But once you get beyond your own shame, then you start to realize it's not your fault if you don't know something. It's more of the mechanism. It's more about how we teach and what we teach. And then that's what got me thinking, as a journalist, I do have an opportunity to maybe change it a little bit, to maybe use my work to teach others about these underserved communities. Through the Nisei, I started learning about African Americans and Native Americans and many other communities that have lived similar lives, that have faced similar issues. And it gives me a deeper understanding of how the commonality of people of color in the United States, the difficulty in their history, but how little we teach that. And the fact that we don't use these chapters in our history to teach and improve our country enough. I mean, I know there are attempts, and the people on this panel absolutely do that. But as we all know, we've been moving in a direction in this country that is actually against that. They would prefer you to know less, not more. And there should never be a philosophy that the less you know, the better. It should always be the more you know, the better. Yeah. So I've always used, once I started going down these roads, I've tried to use my platform to better tell these stories, and they're constantly evolving. And I use the expertise of people that are on this panel to help me decipher what a good story would be and how to tell that story.
Thanks. Alice, you study a lot about war and memory. What's your take on this sort of question about our historical amnesia, our inability to remember?
So I have been at UC Santa Cruz in the history department for 30 years, and I will say that every year I survey students and I ask them, what have you learned about World War II? What have you heard about the experience of Japanese Americans? And I will say that as the years have gone by, students have known less and less. There used to be a time when Farewell to Manzanar was taught in many high schools and middle schools, and it was standard reading. But as, you know, and there are a lot of factors that contribute to this, but some has been, you know, teach to the test, teach to multiple choice questions. And so in many cases, students arrive at UC Santa Cruz, which is an esteemed institution that helped produce Philip here, without knowing a lot of this history. And so when I ask them what they've heard about the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, many have said that they know it took place, but that's pretty much it, right? They don't know about the story of the 442nd. They don't know about the loyalty questionnaire. They don't know about, you know, the struggle to get redress. In fact, most of them don't even know that Japanese Americans got, you know, that the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 basically provided $20,000 to surviving incarcerees, right? They don't know that history, and they don't know that that redress movement was in part because of the civil rights struggles that took place in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And so once they start learning that history, many of them question, well, why are we not learning this? And I think, you know, part of what David's film does so powerfully is it tells amazing stories. I also let them know that those stories of courage and heroism, right, they had political consequences. So in 1948, there was what was called the Evacuation Claims Act, which provided token compensation that was largely in recognition of the heroism of the 100th and the 442nd. And then in 1952, the Nisei, the Japanese immigrants, were able to gain naturalization rights. A lot of students had no idea that, you know, there was an immigration ban in 1924 that built on the immigration ban against Chinese immigrants, right? And that Japanese immigrants couldn't become citizens until 1952. That change was also the result of the stories of, and the JCL lobbying, using the stories of the Nisei soldiers in order to win naturalization rights for their parents, right? And so those political consequences help set the stage later for the redress movement, which, you know, a lot of the stories that start being shared really happened in 1981 when the Commission on the Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians held hearings across the country. And Japanese Americans, many for the first time, spoke about what they had experienced when they were incarcerated. And the children of incarcerees, the sansei, right, many of them heard those stories from their parents and their grandparents for the first time. In fact, I've interviewed sansei who later became activists who actually stated that, you know, when they heard their parents talk about camp, they had no idea this was a camp surrounded by barbed wire and sentry towers. They thought it might have been a summer camp that their parents were talking about. And it's finally, you know, during that time that people start sharing their histories. And what I tell students today is that, especially people who have been traumatized by war, there's a understandable reluctance to share that trauma. But once the children and grandchildren start asking, you recover these stories. And once people realize that the later generation really wants to know that history, people start sharing it. And that's, you know, what your film does so beautifully is it shows not only that this history happened, but that people and the later generations, right, want to recover it, want to visit the site. They want to read Stanley Hayami's, right, diary at Janum. So that's my take on it.
Thanks, Alice. Don, you worked on, as I said, the case to reopen the, revisit the Korematsu decision. and also more lately worked on the California's reparations task force. So you've been deeply immersed in looking at this history. What does all this suggest to you about remembrance and why we don't consider that history so deeply?
Well, can I say, I'm looking, in these dark times, I'm looking for inspiration every day. And I gotta say, David Ono's production was masterclass in connecting the dots between the past and the present. And so what I'd like to do is just give a round of applause to David Ono for just an incredible production. And in case you may have, I don't think you missed it, but there was a piece at the end where the link to the website of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was delinked, and an attempt to rewrite that history because it was too DEI. So this erasure of history is a continuing recycle event. One of the things I wanted to say about the title, Defining Courage, is because it is regrettably so relevant today. And the production is just full of ironies. The irony of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team fighting for democracy in Europe while their families are incarcerated at home. The irony of members of the 442nd and the 100th Artillery Division arriving at a Dachau subcamp while their families are incarcerated in concentration camps in the United States. And that continues to resonate today. And one of the things that most people do not know is that the government justified the rounding up of Japanese Americans by stating that Japanese Americans were committing acts of espionage and sabotage. So it required the rounding up of 125,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were born in this country, as the production showed. There was only one problem with that. It was entirely made up, and the government knew it at the time. And when Fred Korematsu's case came before the Supreme Court in 1944, the Justice Department had in its files intelligence reports from the FBI, from the Federal Communications Commission, from the Navy intelligence, categorically refuting the claims of the government that there was a good reason to round this population up. So when we talk about defining courage, it's another irony. You have soldiers who are 19 years old. I think the average age was 26. I think probably younger than that, fighting these battles. And yet, in Washington, D.C., from lawyers in very high places, with Harvard and Yale and Stanford law educations, they couldn't muster the courage to tell the truth. And there were whistleblowers among them saying, we're about to tell lies to the U.S. Supreme Court. We have evidence in our own files contradicting the Army's claims. We know that there are, quote, intentional falsehoods. But they couldn't muster the courage to tell the truth. And how true is that today, when alternative facts are trotted out in place of the real ones? And look where we're at. So I think that's the lesson of David's production. That, yes, democracy takes courage to defend. And while these young men were putting their lives on the line, other people in comfortable places, putting nothing at risk, couldn't muster the courage to tell the truth. And that's really a lesson for us today.
What Don and also the slide from David's production referenced, once again, is that 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Army took off of its webpage, removed the kind of history of the 100th 442nd Battalion. It actually republished it. It was initially housed under the U.S. Army's webpage, talking about the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the military. And now that is completely gone. And so what it lists the 100th 442nd down as a key military unit, stripped of any sort of racial context, which is absurd since it was race that really drove everything in the first place. But what we're seeing here then is the kind of systematic erasure of our history as well. So not only don't we have a good grasp of that history, but the tenuous histories that have been constructed, that David and others have sought to present to us, are slowly slipping away.
Can I add, Michael? So that happened on March 14th, and the Japanese American Citizens League, the same day, demanded that it be restored. And as you point out, right, it was restored, but not under the heading of Asian American Pacific Islander. And part of why that history is really important is because there was longstanding discrimination in the U.S. military that, you know, David's film eloquently shows, right? But it also affected other members of the armed forces too. And so at the same time that that was taken down, Arlington National Cemetery also took down their page identifying the Tuskegee Airmen graves as notable graves. And so it was part of this basically system-wide campaign to take away the role of race in the military, even though that's part of what makes the courage of these soldiers so powerful, right? Whether, despite the racism that they experienced, they wanted to serve their country and they wanted to fight for democracy, even when they were denied democracy at home.
I'm going to take a different turn here with you, Philip.
All right.
You know, and in particular, I mean, your plays have chronicled a lot of the experiences of Japanese Americans through the decades.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been thinking too, you know, we have a lot of historical work, sociological work, anthropological work, a lot about both the incarceration experience as well as, you know, increasingly things about the Japanese American contributions to the military during World War II. But there's a particular power about the creative arts that many of those things don't exactly address. And what is the power of sort of like David's performance, your plays, your operas, your films, in conveying that experiences in ways that really capture some dimension of the human experience, the human soul, in ways that certainly the academic accounts that Alice and I read about often don't get at?
Well, first I'd like to say is, you know, I've written about the Japanese American experience for a long time. And I feel like I kind of understand and know a lot of what's out there. What I found remarkable about David's piece is that it was so moving, and that what it allowed was new information to come forward. And I think the value of a piece like David's, and art in general, is that it provides emotional truth, provides a different space where you can have emotional truth. And emotional truth is layered, it's nuanced, it even allows spaces for contradiction. And I thought this particular piece really captured the idea of contradiction, and that is housed in toto in a human being, and how that all can be happening, layered complexity. And that is the power of art and the power of a piece like David's, that it does allow emotional truth, and it allows a space for new information and new experiences to be conveyed. And so I was extremely moved, David. I thought it was remarkable.
Thank you. Thank you.
David, would you like to speak to that too?
Yeah.
Why use the form?
Well, look, art and music, look, I'm not an expert. I'll be the first to say. And in fact, as a journalist, you struggle to find people who will pay attention to what you do because it's so dry sometimes. You're often reciting facts and you're trying to be as fair as possible, but what you really need is emotion. For something to stick with somebody and to think of it and remember it and actually you have to find a way to have people feel that person. And in essence, we're trying to bring people back to life from 80 years ago. And if you can successfully do that and make you feel Stanley Hayami and see him writing in his diary, and you feel his innocence, but also you feel his optimism and his willingness to fight for the country, and then he dies, helping two of his comrades. And if people feel that, then they remember it, and then they hold on to it, and it makes you almost self-analyze, what is it about this person that speaks to me? But once you understand that person, then you understand the predicament that person is in, the nuances of it, the difficulties of it, and you learn about a chapter of history. And then the bigger, more mind-blowing part of it is he's one person, but he speaks for a generation, and he speaks for hundreds of thousands of people who have the same difficulties and live through the same turmoil that is unfair and in many cases tragic. And so you've taught people about a whole era in the world, in our country, by pushing their emotion, by having them feel the person first. And then once you feel it, then they get it.
What's the role of music in integrating all this? I was thinking of this.
Well, I do believe music is the secret weapon, because the way the brain works, you actually tell the people how to feel before you said a word to them. The notes you hear that go through your ears and your brain already put you in a mood. And once you're in that mood, you start to build the story. And you let them start melding everything together, the music, the imagery, the words, and you suck people in. And they're already feeling a certain way, even though they don't know specifically why they're going to feel that way, but you already have them. And that's what I really appreciate about theater and the arts. You know, I'm not an expert at it, so what I do is I find composers, and you heard the music. This is all original music, and the reason why we made it original is because we didn't want to get sued by using copyrighted music. My early version had Coldplay and John Legend. It was bad. It was awesome. Bad, I mean good. But then I was told, look, do you want to get sued? I'm like, no. So we wrote music, and I enlisted help. And you heard the final product, and I'm moved by this music. Granted, I've heard it a bit, but I'm moved by it. And if I'm moved by it, then my hope is the audience is moved by it.
Let's go back a little to history. You had this quote, too, from Harry S. Truman. You know, in July of 1946, President Truman presented the 442nd Regimental Combat Team with the Presidential Unit Citation. And you had the quote, too. And in fact, it's the voiceover of Truman himself saying at the ceremony, "You are now on your way home. You have fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you have won. Keep up that fight, and we will continue to win." You know, it's been often said that the Nisei soldiers were fighting on two fronts, both the fascism, maybe in the European theater, but also the kind of institutionalized racism that they experienced here in the United States as well. Sort of, what's your take on Truman's remarks, though? And in hindsight, how might we assess its meaning?
Part of the thing I would question is the last ending piece, and you have won. You know, I think it's a mixed bag here. On the one hand, the Nisei soldier, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, redress and reparations are really textbook lessons on the meaning of the Constitution. And yet, our history continues to be recycled. This toxic racial pathology continues to recycle. And just want to remind people, I mean, Black Americans have fought in every war, from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War to World War I, World War II, so on. And you know, during the 40s, in the middle of Jim Crow, 30s and 40s, there are instances when black soldiers fighting in segregated units, like Japanese Americans, returned to the States and were lynched for wearing an American uniform. And so the idea that you have won, I'd like to believe that, and in some cases, our presence here and putting on this very DEI production, David, thank you, is kind of indication that, yeah, we are winning. But the other message is, it really is a never-ending battle, and it requires vigilance and requires courage. Universities like this are being sued. Teachers are being taught, being regulated as to how to teach history.
Budgets cut.
Budgets cut. I served on the California Reparations Task Force. We were looking at Texas school books that referred to enslaved people as workers. And the Florida State Board of Education adopted a curriculum that basically had said that enslaved people learned benefits, learned trades that would benefit them in later life. Well, that's kind of like saying, you know, slavery was good because it gives people exercise and sunshine. You know, who knew that slavery was a Jobs Act? So this is the kind of erasure of history, changing things around, sterilizing it, cleaning it up, that we are, again, watching now. So it makes productions like this really all the more important.
You know, in keeping with that, this whole idea of Gore Vidal's statement about the U.S., America, United States of amnesia, I think of it rather as the United States of selective memory, and that there are certain things that certain people in places of power are very selective about remembering. And so as a consequence, the same forces, in my opinion, that put Japanese Americans in concentration camps in World War II, it's the same through line that's functioning and happening now that's allowed all the anti-Asian hatred, anti-immigrant hatred to surface again. And it's because certain groups understand the story and that they don't forget it. They remember what worked before and unfortunately are putting it in play now. And so that's also something to think about.
So I'll add, right, it's a powerful quote when Truman makes it, but as Don mentioned, right, racism was hardly vanquished, and I'll just give you two dates. In 1946, the Rescission Act basically nullified a promise that Truman and General Douglas MacArthur made to Filipino veterans, promising them that they would be recognized, would gain the right to become citizens, would get veterans benefits. It basically canceled that promise. And it would take decades, basically not until the 2000s, when there would be some progress in the Filipino veterans equity movement. And in fact, Daniel Inouye introduced legislation in 2001, right, to try to get that injustice rectified. And then I'll also say, you know, the armed forces were officially desegregated in 1948, but that's partly because in 1946, Isaac Woodard, an African-American member of the Army, hours after being honorably discharged, wearing his uniform, boarded a bus to go home to South Carolina, was taken off that bus by South Carolina policemen, beaten brutally, became permanently blind as a result. And that, along with the longstanding activism of A. Philip Randolph, led to the official desegregation of the armed forces. So racism was hardly vanquished. And I would say, you know, it takes until 1988, when redress is finally passed, for the surviving Japanese Americans. Bear in mind that most of the Nisei were not alive to get redress. And of course, it was not, you know, it was not an equitable amount, right? They got $20,000. It was token compensation. And it was in part passed because it was recognized as token compensation and because it was described as not setting a precedent because it would be limited to the actual survivors of the injustice, right? Since then, thanks to Don and others, right, there has been an argument that other groups deserve redress because of the clear evidence of historic discrimination and injustice. So, you know, and of course, you have probably heard about the Alien Enemies Act, right, which is being touted as the precedent for mass deportation. That was an act from 1798, which was originally used to attack French immigrants who were seen as supporters of Thomas Jefferson, right? And it was part of a conflict between Federalists and the Jeffersonians, but is now being, and was used during World War II, right, to incarcerate Japanese, Italian, and German immigrants, but is now being weaponized to try to justify mass deportation of the undocumented. And so, sadly, I tell my students history is not over, history's not always remembered, and history is constantly being repeated and misrepresented. And if people don't take action, it will continue to be abused.
Sort of running ahead of my questions there.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. No, I just wanted to just say, too, about the notion about Truman says you face those enemies on two fronts and you've won. It's still that, the period of resettling, of coming out of the camps and settling in various parts was definitely a mixed bag. And you have little stories like, Daniel Inouye in full dress uniform getting refused a haircut.
In San Francisco.
In San Francisco. So and as well as think about the kinds of institutional forms of discrimination, including around naturalization laws. So Japanese aren't able to become naturalized citizens until 1952 with the McCarran-Walter Act. And so there's been, whether or not that history can impact sort of the kinds of other institutional arrangements that are going on is always a kind of a mixed story. It brings me to this question, which you've touched upon, Alice, and I'd like each of you to sort of talk about it more, which is that, as Don was talking about, we've witnessed recently attacks on democratic institutions and also established laws, policies, and practices. And in fact, question I want you all to address, coming off of this spectacular performance of Defining Courage, is think about how do the injustices of the past continue to haunt us in the present? And for example, the suspension of civil liberties in the name of national security during World War II is reflected today in sort of the militarization of our southern border and the deportation of undocumented and indeed documented aliens from the United States. So how does our past continue to inform and shape our present? And how do those injustices that folks have experienced in the past continue to haunt us today?
Well, it gets back to, again, what I was saying in just a bit, that, the history, aspects of history are remembered by certain people and how to empower them and use them, and that there's a continuum in terms of what happened to the Japanese Americans. This is apart from all the mechanics of it, which everyone else is quite an expert on. Talking about the through line just in terms of institutionalized racism that plays through from then and even to now, and how easily it was to create all this anti-Asia kind of Asian hatred, how easily it seemed that you could create out of what in America this hatred for immigrants. It's kind of like, where does that come from? And I think it's part of something that is always there, and we have to be so kind of aware of it, and also the fact that what triggers that, who can gain control of it and make it move and shape in the way they want it to. That's the thing that concerns me a great deal. How to be vigilant and how to recognize when that is happening, and how do they make it happen such that they can take something like hatred, lies. We're moving into a whole other area here, lies, and they can move to their own kind of ends. That doesn't answer your question, but it sort of answers.
Well, so I have written about a campaign in 2019 when Donald Trump, during his first administration, there was a family separation program. Japanese Americans with a broad coalition of groups that involved African American, Latino groups, came together at Fort Sill, which was an Army base, right? And basically the highlight and what got a ton of publicity were the former incarcerees who were part of Suru for Solidarity. They came, they wore placards showing themselves as children during World War II, and basically used their moral authority as victims of an unjust incarceration to argue against separating children from their parents. And that was a really powerful example. And when students see that, and they realize, right, that people can take a stand, people can make a difference, and people can help protest, the repetition of history. The other example I will give is, I see now people who are afraid to publicize DEI, and that includes universities. Some of you have heard about what happened at Columbia, the blackmailing of funds, which after the funds were withdrawn and the university, along with Harvard, right, tried to accommodate demands, weren't returned, right? We now have an administration that is going after not just protest actions, but people who write op-ed pieces, people who basically challenge what they see as injustice. And that danger to free speech and free thought endangers all of us, right? So I'm on the front lines at a university. I have deliberately not removed the fact that I helped create critical race and ethnic studies, and that was in response to student protests at UC Santa Cruz. If you know anything about UC Santa Cruz, we have a fine protest tradition, as does Berkeley. I will acknowledge that. And that basically, right, rather than trying to hide that, I think we have to defend diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it is not a dirty word. The worst thing that we can do is to allow people to misrepresent it in that way.
Don? No, you get David the last one.
They're coming for you, Alice.
Yep, and I'm ready.
So this is a really old playbook that David's production has sort of shined a light on. Think Germany in the 1930s. It's the playbook of demagoguery, basically 3 elements. 1, appeal to prejudice. 2, fearmonger and scapegoat. And 3, traffic in fake news, falsehoods, alternative facts. And it continues to recycle. So it's really quite astounding when you have a presidential candidate, a vice presidential candidate, can stoke this racism by saying Haitian immigrants who are lawfully here are eating your pets and get away with that. And so, again, think Germany, 1933, think other countries with authoritarians in power, and I think you could see the commonality. One thing I would comment about, where does this racial pathology come from? Philip mentioned this. I used to think, maybe 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, maybe that's where, or the alien land laws targeting Japanese Americans. But after sort of taking a deep dive in this reparations effort, the pathology comes from somewhere. And it began long before Japanese Americans arrived on these shores. It's not 1942 or 1941, think 1619. Because the values and the prejudices and the fears that were necessary to prop up the institution of slavery for 2.5 centuries and Jim Crow for another 100 years just morphed into different forms over the decades to put a target on the backs of not just black Americans, but whatever the disfavored group du jour happens to be. And in 1941, 42, it was Japanese Americans. In today's world, it's immigrants, or it's Muslims, or whatever. But this idea that people can be dehumanized to such a level that they don't count, they're not Americans, they're not like us, that theme continues to recycle and reverberate. And that's the lesson, I think, of this production. And so we sort of tend to isolate and silo it into one minority community's experience. And what I think it really is part of an American tradition, and it's rooted quite deeply in the nation. And so that's what we have to unpack to change this culture. So again, I applaud David for turning this art, this history lesson into art. Feel the emotional impact, makes a difference.
Thanks, Don.
Yep.
I'm gonna give David the last word on all this.
Yeah.
And preface this by saying thank you very much for that incredibly moving and ways that really captured both the horror and cruelty of war, but also of sacrifice and heroism in the face of that. But also, to think about in terms of, as I said, how we continue to confront these injustices in the present. And what does that mean? How do we define courage now?
And that's, I think, the ultimate message we're trying to send. We don't do it with a sledgehammer. We do it delicately. But I think about the Nisei soldier quite often because I do use them as a kind of a barometer to courage. If you read what they dealt with, their families incarcerated while they're literally dying on the battlefield, and it's a level of commitment that the vast majority of people in our country today would never give or have. But at the same time, I think about where our country has come in those 80 years, and I think we had these, the Stanley Hayamis in the world and the Nisei soldiers standing here with us today, witnessing what democracy is today and the level of cowardice that's in Washington right now, but not just that. The level of cowardice that's in our financial world with people who are billionaires and heads of countries and companies that you would think have enough money and would not be scared of the truth. But it's just the opposite because they want more billions and they want to stay on that leaderboard as the richest in the world. And as a result, they're willing to sacrifice mankind and honesty and decency for an opportunity to stay among the wealthiest. And I think that's horrible. Our government was built with, the balance of powers. And there is no longer a balance of power because of cowardice in all the different branches that are supposed to watch each other. And now they don't. They bow to one particular branch. And so that's why I say there is an exceptional lack of courage in our country. And my hope is the next generation understands that and finds a way to go beyond that and be courageous as they go into our world and fix it. Because the people that are running it today are cowards.
Thank you, David.
Well said.
And I'd also like to thank all the panelists for their insights and their presence here today. Thank you. And I'd like to thank you, too. Thank you for being present here, and thank you for being here for this conversation. And I'm sure, if you'd like to come up and talk to some of these folks afterwards, I'm sure.
Can I say one thing
Sure.
real quickly? Right here in San Francisco or the Bay Area, the MIS Historic Learning Center, they're having a couple of programs. I Am an American. The Nisei Soldier Story is coming February 20th of 2026. Please go and support them. The National Veterans Network is part of that. But they're continuing on with the Nisei story. They're telling Medal of Honor stories as well as others. And I feel like we need to support in any way we can because it's not just about ignoring the history. Sometimes some entities, and I won't get into it, are actually trying to rework history and revise history. And part of the revisions is eliminating this chapter. So the more people come out and support these different events, this community, the stronger we become.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.